Uh-oh, I hear it. It's the whistling. That song, of course, is from the very famous movie, The Bridge on the River Kwai, and we're going to talk about the subgenre that Bridge on the River Kwai is in, and I'm going to give you a top 10 list of soldier POW movies, prisoner of war camp movies involving soldiers. There's a lot of excellent ones, and here's my top 10 list coming up next. Soldier, prisoner of war camp movies are really interesting. In this list, I'm not including, say, ordinary civilian prisoner movies like, say, Holocaust movies. I'm only focusing on ones that have soldiers or mostly soldiers in them. And they're really interesting to me because I think prisoner of war camp movies sort of talk about a state of nature and tyranny together. That is, in these movies, you see how people react or are depicted in a pure survival state where there's a man-to-man or government tyranny oppressing them, as in Japanese prisoner of war camp movies, as in British concentration camp movies, where you have these overlords sort of telling you what to do and creating a severe scarcity in food and supplies. Here, how do people survive in this scenario where they have almost no food and no medicine at all, and they're in a harsh environment like a prison? The other part of these movies is nature is an oppressor too. Famine, disease, weather, all of these usually play a factor in these movies, and so the suffering prisoners have to deal with the tyrants who are lording it over them, who have captured them and put them in these awful prisons, and then nature, which is a tyrant of her own in a way, and that's not neither good or bad, but pure survival happens in these movies. So I find them an really interesting intellectual exercise overall for the movie makers to tell us what they think people will do in these brand new brutal environments and what they're saying about humanity, its goodness or badness, and its spirituality in general. This list is going to surprise you, so wait for a few surprises. Don't be annoyed, but think about what I'm trying to tell you I think is number 1 versus this movie, number 10. I'm actually putting here The Bridge on the River Kwai.
And your group here?
Mostly Aussies, some Lime, some British, Indians, Burmese, Siamese.
And what happened to them?
They died.
In fact, I'm going to put at 9 and 10 these two movies, one of which is the very famous Bridge on the River Kwai, but 2 is an answer to it, the more recent To End All Wars, about the exact same prison camp experience during World War II where the Japanese had captured American and British soldiers. Now, of course, the Bridge on the River Kwai is famous not just for the Colonel Bogey March, for Alec Guinness and William Holden, and for David Lane's great direction, but just as sort of this epic movie that is about a bunch of guys trying to figure out how to live in a prison camp. And of course, this movie depicts the British as being entirely irrational, or maybe not, because they're acting British, they're maintaining their marching orders, and they're maintaining their militaristic duties. Meanwhile, the American, played by William Holden, looks on, and I think he sees them as sort of crazy or ridiculous. Here you are in a pure survival scenario. Why are you acting as if you're in civilization still? To me, the movie is very bleak, and it ends with one of the more famous ending lines of all movies: madness, madness. And that in and of itself has been responded to time and time again by directors who want to deny that World War II is just madness or that 20th century civilization is crazy or mad. But this movie hints or even argues that that's the very thing. And To End All Wars, this movie says that these men in the camp actually were Christians and converting some of the Japanese soldiers in them. And it is a very different take on the whole experience. In fact, it's a very strong argument that The Bridge on the River Kwai is a big pack of lies, and it itself depicts the more real experience. I find these two movies put together are really interesting as sort of seeing how movies can philosophically and logically and spiritually, theologically argue with each other. So these are two excellent movies to sort of watch close together. Number 8, really interesting movie, not well known, from the mid-2010s is Land of Mine.
Angenommen, ihr schafft 6 Minen pro Stunde und jagt nicht euch selbst in die Luft, kann ihr in 3 Monaten wieder zu Hause sein. Habt ihr verstanden?
Jawohl, Herr Feldwebel!
Du, willst du etwas sagen?
Nein, Herr Feldwebel!
Bist du sicher?
Absolut sicher, Herr Feldwebel!
Land of Mine, I think, is made from a Denmark director. It's about a fascinating real-world experience in which, after World War II, German POWs were taken by Denmark, or by the Denmark army or soldiers in Denmark, and made to explode landmines that the Germans had planted all over the beach, the coastal area in Denmark. This movie will play with your sense of morality. On the one hand, you're saying to yourself, well, these are Nazi soldiers, they ought to be punished in some way. But on the other hand, they're all 17, 18 years old, and you know there were men forced into the army perhaps, and here they're going to potentially blow themselves up by, taking apart these landmines, and many of them do. This movie is a lot like The Wages of Fear in that the tension is all in when will somebody be blown up by a landmine, but they're 17 to 18-year-old kids. And so that very disturbing fact that after World War II, these kids were put into slavery, into prisoner of war camps, and made to do this awful thing. I think this movie will definitely play with your sense of morality, who is good and who is bad. And it's really tense and interesting, well-shot movie. So Land of Mine is quite a good prisoner of war camp movie. Number 7 is uber famous. I'm even putting it number 7. This could be number 1, number 2. In a way, the rest of the order doesn't matter too much, but The Great Escape.
The Germans put all their rotten eggs in one barbed wire basket, and they hatched the most ingenious escape plan in the history of war.
The Great Escape is iconic for showing, first of all, British versus Americans. Oftentimes in these prison camp movies, they display the differences between Brits and Americans. But for Steve McQueen being the cooler king and being thrown into the cooler with his leather jacket and his baseball glove, he's a typical American. And my son, who was a young teenager watching this movie, became his favorite movie because of Steve McQueen's performance and the fact that these men all exert bravery in trying to escape repeatedly from the Nazi prison camp they are held in. Now, I should mention here that The Great Escape from the early 1960s is really kind of a remake, ripping off, but that's not the right word, the Colditz story from the mid-1950s. The Colditz story being a prisoner of war camp movie in which you see soldiers try to break out repeatedly from a Nazi camp, and the movie praises them for doing this. If you watch that movie and then The Great Escape, it's very clear that Great Escape took so much from the Colditz story. I think The Great Escape did it better, though, so I'm putting it here on the list and leaving out the Colditz story, although that is an honorable mention for sure. Number 6 is a favorite from director Billy Wilder. It's the early 1950s movie Stalag 17.
Sort of rough. One American squealing on other Americans. Maybe that Stooley's not an American at all. Maybe he's a German that Kraut's planted in this barracks.
In so many of these prisoner of war camp movies, you have the idea of the individual versus the group, and will this rugged, naked individual out for greed help the group eventually join up with the group? How do we survive? Is it by forming tribes or little groups which help us survive, or by being individuals who are out for our own personal gain? This movie displays that. It's one of the main themes in the movie, with the William Holden character, who is all about himself as this greedy, individualistic American, and yet he's got to learn, I think, to be part of the group. Really well done movie here by Billy Wilder, so I highly recommend it. If you liked any of the previous movies, you probably will like Stalag 17. Now we're into a few movies you might not know, but I think are really good and complex. I've done this movie before on my channel. Number 5, A Man Escaped.
Je savais qu'on fusillait dans l'enceinte même de la prison. Une idée folle me traversa la tête.
Robert Bresson's movie about an individual Frenchman put in a Nazi prison, and how does he get out? The movie is very meticulous about showing how he gets out, but it's an existential classic. And I advise you just to watch my video on it, because I think it'll make you want to watch the movie if you have any interest in the material at all. Quite well done. Number 4 is actually a humongous movie. This will take up a lot of your time, but by the great Japanese director Kobayashi. It's The Human Condition.
Этого достаточно, чтобы признать тебя военным преступником.
それだけで戦争犯罪人の資格は十分だ。
僕は否認することもできたんだ。証拠はないんだから。
The Human Condition is a vast story about Japanese prison camps during World War II and Japanese fighting in the Pacific in World War II. It's a 9-hour movie, okay? So it's a humongous commitment, and it's broken up for us now into 3 parts. Part 1 is about the Japanese running a Chinese prison camp, and it focuses on a Japanese, young idealistic Japanese officer who runs the camp and runs into basically absolute hate for the Chinese by the Japanese, and he has a heart. He's some an idealist, and so he doesn't really fit in with the Japanese, but he also needs to run the prison camp efficiently. There's more, though. He actually ends up in a prison camp later on in the human condition, and so you have both sides. Actually, the jailer becomes the jailee. The man running the prison becomes a prisoner later. And I won't give too much of this movie away except to say it's magnificent. It ought to be watched and studied, because obviously Kobayashi is saying this is the human condition, being jailed and being a jailer. And so what is the human condition? The movie's all about that. Number 3, the great granddaddy probably of all these movies. Famous movie by French director Jean Renoir. It is The Grand Illusion. This movie is quoted in all the movies I have mentioned so far. World War I prison camp involving Nazis who become later, troped and cliched prison guards and wardens who are sort of like classic Nazi stooges or classic Nazi masterminds and sort of evil, Nazis who are keeping these men imprisoned in a horrible prison camp scenario. Certainly the Colditz story quotes this movie, and I think even something like the American TV show, the goofy one, Hogan's Heroes. And so The Grand Illusion, you have to watch it because it's showing you all the things that are going to happen and sort of reworked in The Great Escape, Bridge on the River Kwai, and so on. So watch this movie to see one of the first and maybe the greatest of all POW movies. However, I love number 2 as a movie. It's so interesting. It's in the Criterion Collection, but hardly anybody knows about it. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence.
You have been found guilty on all charges. The sentence will be carried out without delay.
Jimmy! I don't need any help. I've practiced walking for years.
This is like, in a way, the setup of The Bridge on the River Kwai, where it's a Japanese prison camp during World War II, and you got British soldiers there. David Bowie is in this movie, and I find that any movie that David Bowie was in is actually good or very interesting because he's a quite charismatic actor. And here he plays a charismatic British guard, and the Japanese guard is, the warden is jealous of him, and I won't tell you why, but it's interesting. There are 2 musicians playing 2 of the main characters in this movie. I find that this movie is a fascinating riff on all the previous movies. It's got a different flavor. It's weirder, for one thing. And the themes that come up, love between males, love or friendship, or what are the differences between male loves in just terms of being friends versus actually being lovers, and the differences, stark differences between Japanese culture and British culture, between East and West come up here, even in the title, Merry Christmas. Did the Japanese say Merry Christmas? They celebrate it. The Japanese versus West thing in the early 1980s when Japan becomes a key part of the world. It's already been that way, but a key part of the world economy. And was Japanese civilization in comparison to Western civilization. The movie is all about that. And this movie has, to me, one of the top 5 or 10 most haunting images I have ever seen in movies. I will not spoil it. It does involve David Bowie, but you will know it when you see it, when you watch this movie. It's near the end. It is just a magnificent, beautiful, and awful image. So there you go. Go watch this movie just to see the shot that I'm talking about. My number 1 movie is not well known, but I think it's a really interesting response to every movie that came before it. The Great Escape, Bridge on the River Kwai, Stalag 17, Grand Illusion. This movie at number 1 to me, I just really like. And it may not fit at number 1. You may not think it's number 1 once you watch it. But I want to give it some attention, and I think the black and white cinematography, the acting, and the major themes of this movie, the direction is quite good, but the major themes really are potent. This is the 1965 movie King Rat.
You're not thinking what I think you're thinking, are you?
You got it. Only we're not gonna eat it.
Eat it? Eat what? What's he talking about?
Rat meat.
You're out of your mind. Do you think anybody would buy rat meat?
Will you let me finish?
King Rat really talks about the prison camp as a survival scenario, and it features a man who is an American corporal, low in the military hierarchy, but he raises up to be quote-unquote king in this Japanese prison camp, where he's able to negotiate, buy and sell things, and work his way up to being the richest person in the prison camp, but also the provider of a number of goods and services in the prison camp which the prisoners need. This movie contrasts capitalism, which the King Rat here, the character played by George Segal, represents, with socialism and the doling out of food done by the British officers in this movie. Everybody in this movie is out for themselves, as opposed to, say, The Great Escape, where they're all working together to escape. Here in the movie, first of all, this is a pure survival tales. It tells us it's not about escape because you can't escape. The jungle is too harsh. It's impossible. So you must just survive. And in order to do so, you have to look out for number one, yourself. And you will see everybody in this movie sort of resort to a basic state of nature in trying to wheel and deal themselves to prosperity, which is basically just getting a bite to eat. This is a really interesting movie as well because it shows you the before and after pictures of war. What happens when these men doing shameful things in the camp, stealing from each other, what did they do after the war, and what did they feel like after the war? They feel ashamed of what they did in the prison camp, because in the prison camp they were out for themselves, stealing from and harming each other. What do they do after the war? That's what this movie does so well. It gets you to think about what it's like to get out of the prison camps and go back to civilization and be thrust back into it almost immediately. The prison camp world of pure survival and the tyrannies of nature and, the governments like the Japanese, and then getting out and becoming civilized immediately. What are the differences between the two? And are we different people when we're in one situation than another? Those are the questions this movie asks you. Now, what are your favorites from this lot? What else would you mention here? There are a lot of these movies. Many of them are quite good, and I haven't mentioned them here, so feel free to put them in the comments. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to this channel for more content. Thanks, and have a great day.